Behold, the final chapters of Pliny's letter 616, chapters 20 through 22. So this is the very end of the letter. Let's go ahead and give a translation and a discussion. So, when the day has been given back, we are implying an S, but if you want to, you could just merely say, having been given back. In other words, when the day returned, this day, from isea id, meaning it, the day, which is masculine, which is why the is, not the ea, which would be feminine, not the id, which would be neuter, but since it's not a person, we're going to refer to it as an it. So it, or this day, the third, tertius, from the one, from it, from the day, which he had seen most newly, in other words, most recently. So in other words, he's essentially saying in Latin, 2 days later, or 3 days later, because they count inclusively. His body, corpus, having been found, a perfect passive participle from invenio, invenire, and again, if you would like, you can imply an S to make it not a perfect passive participle, but a verb. His body was found, has been found, or you can keep it a perfect passive participle, having been found, and then there are three adjectives that describe that body. Intergum is where we get the word integrity, which is going to mean intact. Elisum, from lido lidere, lysi lysus, meaning to harm, so unharmed. The ill on the front, meaning obviously the same prefix as in, but due to alliteration, it is, or assimilation I should say, it is going to mean obviously changed to an il. So unharmed and covered, having been put on, it's referring to the clothing that he is of course wearing, having been covered, having been put on as he had been. Remember that when there is no subjunctive, is going to translate as or like or just like. The habitus, which is from originally the verb habeo habere, but habitus as a fourth declension noun is going to mean an appearance. That's why when you describe the clothing that a nun will wear, it's often referred to as a nun's habit. It's their appearance. And so therefore, the appearance of his body, more similar to, and this is a present active participle that is substantized, to a person resting than to a person, and this is from the verb fungor, fungi, functus sum. It's one of those deponent verbs that require an ablative object, but it means to be defunct, in other words, to die. Fungo means to function or perform. De fungo is going to mean, obviously, to not perform, not function, and so therefore to die. So it's more similar to a person resting rather than to one having died. A perfect passive looking participle. The adjective simile, simile, simile requires a dative object, which is why both of those are in the dative case. Meanwhile, in chapter 21, at Misenum, again this is the locative. Remember that the locative for a second declension noun, which is a city, town, or small island, me senum, me seni, if it's first or second declension in singular, it will look the locative like the genitive case. So meanwhile, at Misenum, my mom and I, and then of course we have obviously an apposio pieces, but implied that is nothing for the purpose of history. Nor did you, and the reason I'm choosing the word did as my helping verb is because I have voluisti, or I could use the helping verb have, in that both did and have allows the English expression of the perfect tense. Nor did you want to know aliud quam, anything other, anything different than about the death of him. And so in other words, he is not going to tell the story of his mom and his ordeal because the request by Tacitus was only about the death of his uncle. The letter 620, we will come to learn, is going to then provide all of his own personal experience after Tacitus asks about it as well. Therefore, ergo, now, that is either an IA of we fear a giant liar, which would make it a present subjunctive that is independent and not a subordinate clause, and you would say, let me make. Or we could understand this as being, if I see I long E, future will be, because we all know that a long E plus an M will result in an AM. So you have a choice as to whether you want to make it a present subjunctive, let me make, or whether you're going to make it a future indicative, I will make, and end. In other words, brings it into the letter. Either of those are perfectly acceptable. And again, we have the exact same thing from the verb meaning to add. And so I will add or let me add, depending on whether you think of that being an IA, the subjunctive, or whether you think it is going to be an IE, a future indicative. I will add, I will throw to, because it is originally from yaki or yakibe. Nevertheless, so we continue on, and it is an indirect statement. I will add that, and our accusative subject is going to be the may. Remember, when given an accusative object and an accusative pronoun, this pronoun will most likely be the subject, and your infinitive is going to be per secutum, and as we have done several times, we will add an essay. That I followed up. Sequor, sequi, secutus sum. It is a perfect passive looking infinitive, and we translate it actively because it is deponent. I followed up all things which I had been involved. Inter sum, inter esse is going to mean to be involved in, and it is going to take a dative object. Often when you compound the verb sum esse, it requires a dative, and that's why we are not translating quibus as the dative for which, but rather making it merely the object of interfueram. So I followed up all things which I had been involved in, and which immediately I had heard. Again, this is going to be neuter and plural because its antecedent is neuter and plural, and it is accusative because it is the object of audi eram, which has syncope. Remember that it really should be audi veram, but often the V will fall out due to syncopation. So, I will add, or let me add, one thing that I had followed up, or I should say have followed up, all things, in other words, pursued it, made sure that he got the right information, which I had been involved in, and which immediately I had heard, when true things are recalled, are remembered, make it passive, and that's what memoro, memorare means, to call or to force to recall. We're making it passive most greatly. He's, in other words, saying that he indeed, in the moments immediately thereafter the event, he had taken notes, and that is indeed what he is obviously referring to when he is writing this letter. You will excerpt, you will select the most powerful things. In other words, he's saying from this letter that I've written, you will pluck out, which is what ekerpes mean, the most relevant information. And then he goes on to imply it is one thing and implied to write, scribere. It's one thing to write a letter aliud. It is another thing implied to write history. And then he goes on to repeat it with that scribere again. It is one thing to write to a friend. It is another thing, aliud, to write to all. In other words, for the public. And so he is again in this kind of faux humility, saying, I'm merely just a letter writer. This is just a letter. You're going to be able to put it into a magnificent, greater genre of history. I'm just writing facts to a friend. When you write the history, you're going to be writing it for the public at large. And so therefore, I am just a meager letter writer. You are the historian. Take what obviously you wish to find important and edit it out and select the information that you want. And then of course, as all letters end, he then says, as a command, be strong, or merely just goodbye. So, good luck studying. This completes the letter 616. The letter 620 is obviously going to follow for us as we're going to read about the experience of him and his mom. Please study.